infinite, endless, immortal, unkillable levels of ward. Instant, permanent, 999 plus stacks of Frostbite, deleting everything. Yeah, this one is it, my fellow Runemasters. So, hello and welcome to this greatest creation. What you saw and are seeing is at a 210-ish corruption level, which obviously is nothing crazy, but like, you're seeing how sort of AFK level autopilot, oh wait, was there a boss here? This is. And I am in far from perfect gear here, and even so, it would comfortably go to 500 and in its perfect form, break that sweet 1000 corruption barrier. This is an evolution of my last build, and so many of you wanted to see said evolution in a more complete sense, and that's exactly what has happened. And, oh yeah, this is cheat code level. Like, the amount of ward you have is silly. You have to really try to die. Like, it's an achievement. Like, honestly, if you choose to use this build and actually die, I mean, congratulations. And I don't mean that in any kind of sarcastic way. Like, it really does feel that comfortable. And then, offensively, you just cast for, like, a second, fire off 1 billion frost claws with insane cast speed that then immediately whack 999 stacks of frostbite on the enemy, and then you just walk away because now they're just gonna absolutely disintegrate, taking billions of damage a second from it. This really is a beautiful union of peak defense and peak offense that lets you just casually run around in circles as everything automatically falls over around you as it's unable to touch you in any kind of sense or capacity. The synergies we are playing with and the gear that's woven into it, yeah, it is poetry in motion. Though sadly, this is where I must leave you, for reasons mysterious. I now pass you to Cotton to go over all the details of what, when, why, how, and so on and so forth.
Ladies, gentlemen, and travelers of all ages, nice to meet you Runemasters out there. I'll be picking this one up here by myself, and you've seen it, you've heard Josh talking about it. This is the much deeper, more advanced version of the previous Infinite Frost Runemaster build, where the focus changes slightly, but the bones are still the same, and the result is just a basically unkillable titan of ailment application. So let's talk about how we put the build together, the skills that we are building around, and our specialization points too, our passive point spending as well, and then we'll just go over the gear that we have to make this function and any changes that I would make in, you know, the perfect world where I had literally anything that I could ever wish for. Then finally, we'll just go over how to play it from my time with this so far, and it's also worth noting in this footage, while we do now have all the uniques and a lot of great stats, our gear is not perfect by any means at this stage. None of my uniques have been upgraded into legendaries, my exalted pieces aren't all perfect either, they're mostly just solid in the things that I prioritize above all else, which is just to say this thing is extremely powerful now. It could easily take a much higher corruption level than I'm doing right now, even without any stat changes, but this is just the point that I was at when we got the final unique. But it still has a lot of room to grow, both offensively and defensively, just from better stats than what we have personally, with more frostbite chance, more cold damage or damage over time, or more freeze multiplier or mana efficiency for defensive purposes as well. All that said, let's talk about what actually makes this function and dive right into these skills themselves. First and foremost, let's talk about Frostclaw, as that is our main skill of use within the build. The shot fires out an arc of projectiles in front of you as a base, and you want to start by putting 3 points right into Gift of Winter, right over here. This just sort of gives you an important mana cost reduction, as well as extremely effective chance for mana gain on hit too, which is what helps us stay mana positive overall. Then you want to round back and put 1 point into Rending Cascade for some freeze multiplier, which is nice, then Frozen Rain for further mana cost reduction and some extra damage against frozen enemies at the cost of projectile speed. Then we go back to the right, put 1 point into Fen of the Frozen, then 2 points just into Bright Frost, which gives us some cast speed and some ailments cleansed on cast of Frost Claw, but mostly it's just a gateway to let us put 1 point into Hand of Mortitas, which increase the projectiles per cast, but increases the cost as well. Then we also put 1 point into Volley of Glass, which is massive for boss fights specifically, or hefty rare enemies, as it lets all Frost Claw projectiles hit the same target instead of 1 projectile per cast, and this ups the Frostbite generation ridiculously of it on lower amounts of targets. At this point, the next few upgrades require a few things worked out to properly function, which we'll get into properly later, but to have the skill function at proper efficiency in the best version it can be, I recommend getting your mana regen stat to somewhere from 15 to 20, mine is a little bit low right now, as well as having idols, which combined give you at least 12% mana efficiency with Frostclaw, and also the bonus there of the elemental penetration with it, which is quite nice in its own way. And you can get this from idols. You can get 12% with a single one with a good roll, or with 2 of them if you are a bit less lucky. The higher that you can get in this stat, the more spammable Frostclaw will become, but realistically you gain more by increasing Frostbite chance to actually build your stacks faster, increasing the damage of Frostbite itself, or defensively just going into more freeze multiplier. But even right now where I am, this is right around the breakpoint where if you have the right uniques, the build will shred through the game regardless of what the rest of your gear looks like. The reason for this though is the combination of stats makes Frostclaw relatively spammable. It keeps us from running out of mana too quickly, and that in return lets us get more mana, spend upgrades to lean it back the other direction, and that's the real balancing act of this build. Do you have enough mana generation and efficiency to get the real strongest upgrades in this Frostclaw tree? If so, it's insane. If not, then it'll simply be a weaker but still very functional version where you don't take these upgrades. Anyways, these are going to be 1 rank in Glamdring over here for spell damage per melee damage. It's not really a thing that we'll get anything from, but it's mostly just a gateway to 1 point in Cold Star for a bit of extra damage and area, but the area doesn't matter because we took Volley of Glass, which removes the burst. That lets us, though, get 1 point in On Through the Snow, which makes you actually have an extra cast of Frostclaw every time you cast it from the target location to actually continue further on behind them. Then you get Ever Onward for another cast behind the target for extra mana cost, sure, but again, extra cast, which helps you build up Frostbite faster, it helps you affect larger amounts of targets, and it all gives you ward as well. Then we have a Crack in the Ice, which is the most efficient thing here. I mean, not necessarily for its mana cost, the mana cost is quite a lot additional here, but it makes a Frostclaw come back from the final hit point of it as well, which essentially lets you hit the target right in front of you multiple times instead of just with 1 cast per cast. Then we take 2 points into Shiver Shell here, which gives you some retaliation chance when you're hit to actually just launch Frostclaw off basically for free, and then you also gain ward every time that you cast Frostclaw, which is nice, but it's not how we get the majority of ward. That is our 1 point in Rayoin's Veil. When you cast Frostclaw, you gain ward based on its freeze rate multiplier. So the higher our freeze rate multiplier is, the more ward we get. You get 1 ward per 40% freeze rate multiplier per cast. We have such high freeze rate multiplier, and we cast so ridiculously quickly that is why our ward hits the numbers that it does, going absolutely into the stratosphere here. Not to mention, if you just have a high freeze rate anyways, you'll freeze enemies more often, and then they can't hit you in the first place, which also makes you a lot more survivable. As well, I always recommend getting as many bonus ranks of this skill as you can. You can get a bunch of them on your relic, up to 4 at a time really, and if you do, then the bonus points you want to spend in order are a 2nd rank of Bright Frost over here for the more cast speed, but more importantly to unlock Kolheim Ballista. This gives you extra maximum fire rate increase on Ice Barrage every time that you hit an enemy with Frostclaw. Essentially what this does is make Ice Barrage insanely just more effective than it would be otherwise. So what it does is make it easier to farm monoliths. You just have to launch off some Frostclaws as you're running around. It makes it easier to get the bosses down because you can apply more Frostbite through the Ice Barrage itself, enhance fire rate from the Frostclaw hits. This is just a really effective node in itself, and you want to have the extra ranks to at least get to this point. Then if you have any bonus ranks past that, you just want to stick them into Ardor's Scepter for bonus Frostbite chance per Frostbite hit, which essentially translates to damage ramp up speed. Not literally more damage, but speed of reaching peak damage. Think of it like acceleration in a sort of Frostbite based car. Then we have our secondary damage application skill, which is actually going to be Ice Barrage. You want to start with 5 out of 5 points into Hailstorm over here for enhanced fire rate. We want fire rate increase because that lets us stack up our Frostbite faster, and again, Frostbite is our main sort of damage in this. Then you want to hop over here to Eternal Winter and then stick 3 points in it for increased duration of the effect. Then we take 2 ranks of Biting Cold over here to unlock the ability to put 2 points into Sublimation, which increases the damage and the size of the ice shards at the cost of some fire rate, but that lets us put 1 point into Brittle Fragments, which makes every ice shard shatter on hit, dealing damage in an area around the location that it strikes. Then 1 point into Wintry Blast for extra projectiles at the cost of some fire rate and mana cost, but then also Rune's Conquest, which increases the width of the cone that the ice shards come out, which lets their actual homing effect affect a lot more targets, and this is a large part of what lets us just sort of use this to walk through dungeons very easily. Then past that, you just want to put 2 points into Looming Frost for a bit of an extra bit of damage as the ice shards actually actually come out of the ice barrage throughout the actual duration of it, then 1 point in cryogenesis, just for an extra 20% damage at the cost of some duration. If you do have extra points in this for any reason, you basically just want to put them in cryogenesis for the extra damage, and the duration will go down, but the damage going up is actually quite helpful for this. Or alternatively, 1 point into challenge the elements right here. This increases the fire rate of ice barrage against rare or boss enemies by a significant amount, and it goes up the longer that the ice barrage goes, and this can actually increase your frostbite sack generation quite a bit for bosses, and that is an excellent thing to actually counter with this. Then we have our sort of biggest utility skill of use here, which is going to be Frostwall. Immediately you want to dive down and right and put 1 point into Marching Winter. This increases both the area of the wall and the duration that it lasts, but also it lets us put 1 point into Pyroglass, which changes Frostwall's base cold damage to fire. It also changes the cold tag on Frostwall itself to be a fire tag, which makes it actually work even better with Runic Invocation in ways that we'll talk about in a little bit. But after that, the more important thing is it lets us get Brand of the Invaders. This makes it so any enemy that is either standing in or walking through your frost wall will then get Brand of Trespass applied to them. What this does is unlock the synergy with the Runemaster passive down here, Celestial Doom. 7-point bonus is you deal more spell damage to branded bosses and rare enemies, and you gain ward when you hit a branded boss or rare enemy with a spell. The amount of hits that we launch off in this build is incredible, so if we can apply this brand consistently to bosses and rare enemies, say by plopping a frost wall directly underneath them, then what you do is just get a ton of extra ward generation, as well as a ton of extra spell damage against specifically the hardest types of enemies in the game, the bosses and the rares, which is what really matters, honestly. Then you want to put 3 more points into Marching Winter. This is just a really good passive to actually get more nodes into, and then you want to take 2 points into Chilled Touch. This gives you a 14% damage buff against chilled enemies. All our enemies are going to be chilled because we're doing just constant frost damage. We have some chill chance, so it is just very nice to have this. Then you want to put 1 point into the Dark Cold, which gives you a bit of extra damage over time with Frostwall. While it's up, it's not really a big deal, but mostly this is a gateway to Protection of the Apostate, which gives you ward the first time an individual enemy passes through the Frostwall. Then also Shelter of the Chef, which gives you a bunch of bonus ward as well when an enemy passes through for the first time, depending on their maximum health. Essentially, this gives you up to 200 maximum ward per enemy, depending on just how much health they actually have, because it gives you 1% of their maximum health as ward. Then you just want to put 2 points into Crystals of Projection. This gives you extra ward gain and mana gain when you walk through your own frost wall, with bonuses doubled if this is placed more than 2 meters away from you to begin with. As that, you want to put 3 points into Boosted Kickoff. This gives you up to 6 seconds of Frenzy and Haste when you walk through your own frost wall, with the actual duration decided by how long the frost wall has been up. It's a little bit strange, but think of it this way. If you have your frost wall down for 5 seconds, then you walk through it, you will get Frenzy and Haste for 6 seconds. If you have your frost wall down for only a second when you walk through it, you'll only get about 2 seconds of Frenzy and Haste. It's just the way that the scaling with this works. So essentially, when you're using frost wall, you want to not walk through your own one until it's been about 4 or 5 seconds after placing it, just so you can get the max duration of these buffs before placing a new frost wall and repeating this again, getting you a really nice cycle to let you keep near 100% uptime on Frenzy and Haste and actually longer fights as long as you pay attention to this timer. Then past that, for your final point, you want to have Heaping Cold. This just gives more damage to Frostwall if you haven't cast it in the last 15 seconds, as well as making it free so it doesn't cost mana. This just helps with your mana curve right at the start of a fight, right at the start of an encounter, which is pretty nice to have in general. And then for your last 3 points for this skill, you want to put them all into Flames Unchained. What this does is to have a chance to cast Fireball at any enemy that walks through your frost wall anytime that they do so. The reason that we take this with our last 3 points is essentially because there's just nothing else within range that actually helps us more than this does. It just gives you a bit of extra damage. I know it's fire damage, but it does count as elemental damage, and we have elemental damage boosters. It does count as spell damage, and we have spell damage boosters. So realistically, while it's not the same as doing cold damage, it is still extra damage, and it's the best that we can do with the points that we have here, really. Past that, we're going to be moving on to our more actual proper utility skills. They're a bit more passive, but they're still incredibly important ones to have. The first one being Runic Invocation, as you'll see right here. You want 3 ranks of Attuned Approach here for ward per rune consumed, and mana refunded as well. 3 ranks of Inscribed Patterns over here, which gives us essentially 48% bonus freeze rate and 6% bonus mana regen constantly, as we have 2 Heo runes and 1 Raw rune above our head 95% of the time that we are in combat, partially because we're going to be taking 1 point in Author of Arcana to give Runic Invocation a cooldown, as well as give it a mana refund and damage increase, and then 1 point of Immutable Order, which lets us have 0 attention put all into the actual order of rune generation. Instead, what it does is give you a rune each time that you cast a spell in the order of elemental skills on your hotbar. For example, on the left here we have Ice Barrage, which is a cold spell, which means that it will cast a Heo rune above your head. Then we have Runic Invocation itself, which it skips. Then we have Frostwall, which is a fire scaling tag, the way that we have scaled out, so that will give us a raw rune in the second position. Then we have teleport, which doesn't count as an elemental skill, so again, it skips. And then we have Frostclaw, which again is another cold spell, so the third rune will be Heo. It will always be Heo, Raw, Heo. It will always do that combination, which of course we want because that lets us have Rayowen's Frostguard. This will give us a shield, which gives us 30% damage reduction just in general, as well as a 100% freeze rate multiplier gain, which is really useful for us defensively in general. As well, the shield grants us a large amount of ward when you immediately cast it, as well as some ward per second while it's active. And on top of that, the duration of this effect lasts longer than the cooldown of Runic Invocation with this setup, which means that you can just have these buffs, all of them, active essentially permanently, and that is just incredible in itself. From here, we grab 4 ranks of Adept Runescribing for cooldown reduction on the skill, as well as 3 ranks of Transcriber of Power for a 9-second spell damage and cast speed buff when we cast a skill. Then 4 points in Runic Energy over here for a stacking buff the longer you go without casting Runic Invocation. If you have any bonus points in the skill, you actually want to take out the last point in Runic Energy and instead stick it into Runeslinger up here for the bonus cast speed and current mana gained as ward when you cast Invocation, but more importantly as a gateway to let you put any more remaining bonus points that you have into Elementalist Call. What this does is give you bonus elemental penetration on the next spell that you cast after using Runic Invocation, specifically the next elemental spell. So the way that we really take advantage of this, if you get this skill point here, is to use Runic Invocation before you use Teleport, which you then follow with Ice Barrage. What this will do is give Ice Barrage the elemental penetration, but also the buffs from the Teleport that we cast right before it, which we'll be going over in a second because our last skill here is going to be Teleport itself. In this, you want to put your first 2 points into Crystalline Passage. This will give you bonus armor and cold resistance for up to 4 seconds. After casting Teleport. Then we have Time Dilation, which is increasing the actual stat buff duration of that by 20% with this 1 point. This is also a gateway to Mana Tunnel, which makes it so the next spell that you cast after using Teleport has no cost at all as far as mana, and it has an increase to the cooldown of Teleport itself. What this does in general, though, is it lets us use Ice Barrage, a generally very heavy mana cost skill in the way that we have this build set up, but it lets us use it for free, which increases our actual mana efficiency in general and lets us spam Frostclaw more. So essentially, you never want to use Ice Barrage unless you're using it with this after Teleport. Then you want to take 4 points into Frigid Departure, which increases your freeze rate multiplier by 600% for that buff timer after using Teleport. Then we want 5 ranks into Tunnel Finder for 50% cooldown recovery speed on Teleport itself, and then 1 rank into Rock Phase for stun immunity during this stat buff duration as well, just because it's nice to have full immunity to that. Then we have 1 point in Resonant Plasma for some fire resistance and lightning resistance in that same stat buff timer as well, and then 5 points into Elemental Affinity for increased elemental damage during the timer after you use your Teleport. If you have any bonus points into Teleport, you just want to put them into Time Dilation just to increase the actual duration of the stat buffs that you guessed from casting this skill. Essentially, your main goal outside of this is to get some cooldown reduction as well. If you can get this cooldown of Teleport down to the point where it lasts as long as your duration on the buffs, then you're in a really strong spot as far as your stats go. Then with that, let's move on to our passive skills then. Starting off with our base class of Mage, we simply need 20 points to access the other trees. So we're going to put 8 points into Arcanist here for 8 bonus intelligence, as well as some fire and lightning resistance too. 1 point into Elementalist for some bonus cold damage, which puts us at 9 points spent. Put 1 more into Reactive Ward for 10 points spent to unlock the third row here, which lets us put 5 points into Mage Flurry, which gives us the 3-point bonus of extra cooldown recovery speed for Teleport, most importantly, but also gives us a nice chunk of extra cast speed. Cast speed means faster Frostbite generation. It also means faster ward generation as a result of the Frostclaw casting. So this is just a really good stat for us in general, as long as you have the mana efficiency to sustain increased cast speed. Then with that 5 points spent, you can put your final 5 points into Warden, which is just an extra 50% ward retention, and of course that is a really good defensive stat for us based on how much ward we actually want to keep. Then we move on to our actual Sorcerer skill tree here first, because we want to unlock Ice Barrage for use within the build. You want to put your first 5 points into Arcane Momentum here. This gives you bonus cast speed per stack, which you get when directly casting a skill. You can keep this as long as you cast skills, and we do cast skills, so this is basically just bonus cast speed. Then you get 8 points of Essence of Celerity for increased spell damage per stack, as well as Arcane Momentum bonus duration, and also bonus move speed when you're at maximum stacks of Arcane Momentum, which we will be just sort of constantly. Then you just need to put 2 more points into Cryomancer specifically for cold damage and freeze multiplier, which puts us at 15 Sorcerer points and lets us use Ice Barrage. One of the final things that you will do later on the path to 100 though is fill in the final 6 points here into this skill, making it 8 out of 8, so do remember that for later. Then we have the Runemaster passives themselves, ourselves over here, and we start this with 6 points in unsealed mana for bonus maximum mana and cast speed, as well as some burst mana and ward if you cast 3 free spells in a row. 8 out of 8 in arcane focus over here, which lets you get ward gain every time you directly cast a spell. Again, we have really high cast speed. We're casting Frost Claws just sort of non-stop in a lot of content, which means that we get a lot of bonus ward from this as well, and it also gives us 8 intelligence. More intelligence is more damage, it scales well with our stats, and it gives us more ward retention as well, so it's just, again, a really good skill to have filled out. At that point, you will be at 14 points spent, so we do need to spend some more before reaching the next layer, which lets us spend 3 points into Sphere of Protection for some health and damage reduction from chilled enemies, 2 ranks in Circle of Elements, which gives you some additional chill chance with cold skill, but mostly just this unlocks the ability for us to put points into Freezing Point, which gives us bonus damage over time for our Frostbite, which is pretty good in general, but also converts all armor shred chance on your gear or your stats in general into Frostbite application chance, which is a scale really well with certain gear affixes for the build as well. Then we want to put 1 point into Never Late down here, which gives you bonus critical chance and spell damage for your next skill used after a traversal skill, which again is going to be our Ice Barrage, so this is just further boost to our Ice Barrage. On top of that, with a 5-point bonus, it also doubles your crit chance for the spell cast if it costs 30 or more mana, which again, Ice Barrage does. After that, we want to do something that is a little bit gear dependent. Essentially, the amount of ranks that you want to put into this one, Rune of Dilation, entirely depends on your cooldown recovery speed, essentially. What this does is give you a buff after using Teleport that increases your cast speed and move speed by 10%. The amount of points you put into here directly translates to the amount of seconds that the buff lasts, and essentially you just want this to be slightly longer than your teleport cooldown. Mine is about 6.5 seconds, so I've got the buff duration at 7 seconds so that I can just keep this buff permanently active. That's the whole idea of the amount of points that you want to put in this, and it'll be different for you at different stages of your actual gearing, but that's the idea to stick with it, and we'll talk about where to put the extra points here later on. Past that, you want to put 5 points into Decree of the Eternal Tundra for 100 ward per second, as we will always have a heal rune above our head the way the build functions, and then 6 points into Decree of the Burning Wind down here for increased damage to bosses and rare enemies, doubled with both raw runes and frost wall, which again we will have active constantly. Then that is 45 points spent, which lets us unlock the final tier and put our next 7 points into Celestial Doom. The spell damage on it is nice, but more importantly by far is the extra spell damage and ward gain on hit against branded bosses. We brand any enemy that is in our frost wall, so frost wall is mainly for static encounters like wave clearing, honestly, or bigger rare enemies or bosses to get under them, and then they will be branded. This activates these bonuses, making you really strong as a result. Then past that, you want to put 2 more ranks into Decree of the Burning Wind to finish that off, as it's just more boss and rare damage, which is honestly, if there is a weak point in the build, it's boss killing speed, and it's not really a weak point as a whole in general. I wouldn't say the build is weak at it, it's just weaker than it is at walking through monoliths extremely quickly. Then past that, you want to put 8 points into Ancient Inscriptions here for 8 intelligence, as well as bonus cooldown recovery speed in general per 4 intelligence that you have, which also lets you consistently work out that whole combo with the teleport cycle. Then you want to put your next 6 points into Mental Catalysis, which increases your intelligence as long as you have a catalyst, as well as increasing your bonus damage from crits while you are wielding a catalyst as well. Then for any final points, you just want to put them into Elemental Affinity here for Spellblade, which gives you an increase to your elemental damage and your elemental resistance per rank spent, which is just nice to have in general. That's all the skill-based bones of this build then, so let's talk about the actual gear that we're going to be using, starting off with the uniques that make it truly function properly. First off, we have Snowdrift, the boots. These give you 25% chance to apply Frostbite on hit just in general, 2% cold penetration with Frostbite per 10% freeze rate multiplier, which gives us incredibly high penetration with Frostbite because we are stacking freeze rate multiplier, 30% increased dodge rating is just nice to have, then plus 10 cold damage with spells and attacks, as well as increased movement speed per dexterity. Mostly the purpose of this is increased Frostbite stack generation, as well as the cold penetration on it too is really nice to have. Then we have the quite incredible gloves for the purpose of this build, Frostbite Shackles, which come from the final boss of the Blood, Frost, and Death timeline in the monoliths. These give you up to 143% chance to apply Frostbite on hit, up to 33% increased Frostbite duration, up to 183% freeze rate multiplier, as well as a chunk of ward every time that you freeze an enemy, and ward retention per uncapped cold resistance, meaning this scales with your cold resistance even past the natural cap of 75%. This again lets our ward hit at a much higher number. Then finally for our uniques, we have the Strand of Souls over here, which is mostly just a actual defensive one, which comes from the final boss of the Fall of the Outcast timeline. This one just fully gives us more defense, really, ward gain on potion use, up to 180% of mana spent, as ward gain is really big as well, as we spend a buttload of mana in this build, up to 70% further ward retention too, and then also ward gain on kill and ward per second. So this just sort of rounds out our massive ward pile to make it even heftier than it would otherwise be, and make us even more survivable as a result. Then we come to the rest of your gear, really, and I'll go over the ideal subtype of item for each slot, then more or less give you a stat priority that you want to go from past that conceptually. For wands, you ideally want a Dragon Horn wand. These come with increased cast speed and spell mana cost down implicit affixes, both of which are fantastic for us. For Catalyst, this depends a bit on your specific wants. You can go Opulent Focused for a more ward per second and more ward retention, so survivability, or you can go Chronolab for bonus mana regen and mana spent returned as ward if you're sort of struggling in those departments. For your helmet slot, you want a Runed Visage, ideally, for the mana spent gained as ward as well, and mana regen implicits that are on it, both really fantastic for our build. Then for your chest, you want the Celestial Raiment for the bonus freeze rate multiplier, ideally, as well as all the good that does to a build. Then for accessories, your amulet would ideally be a Sapphire Amulet for more freeze rate multiplier and cold resistance, or you could go Bone or Gold Amulet to help sort your resistances out a little bit too. But Sapphire is ideal if your resistances are affected. For rings, you want one of three things depending on how your gear is feeling in general. Ivory rings are good for bonus ward decay threshold, which makes your ward straight up higher, resulting in more survivability. Opal rings are great for cooldown recovery speed, which helps us get more frequent teleports and keep the related buffs up a bit more often too. Then we have your relic, and there are three options here really, with the ideal one being the Elder Eye for both cold damage and freeze rate multiplier implicits, so both offense and defense, or alternatively for pure offense you could get a Rune Quill for bonus elemental damage over time, which is more damage but no defensive component, or there is also the Warding Scroll for mana spent gained as ward conversion. Generally this is less effective than getting the freeze rate multiplier from the Elder Eye, but this is also a usable option at the very least. Past that then, let's talk about essentially what is our affix priority. Arguably, most importantly, you want 75% in all of your resistances, and I'm a bit lacking right now. It's definitely a hole in my own personal version of this build that I need to fix, at least as far as the poison and physical resistance. Everything else is fine. Past that, you want to hit anywhere from 15 to 20 mana regen. 18 is nice, but it requires quite a lot more of the stat actually on your gear, but this is sort of the sweet spot where it functions effectively with this build, but also will not go out of mana too quickly. You can't literally hold Frostclaw forever unless you're up to like 18 to 20, but you can make it a good 20 to 30 seconds of full spam once you're around 15, which means that you just have to choose some occasional breaks to take. Past that, you want freeze rate multiplier as much as you can get wherever you can get it. It's just way too good of a stat for us. Then you want chance to apply Frostbite on hit, or Frostbite on hit with cold skills, or also chance to shred armor. Both of them do sort of the same thing for us effectively as we convert shred armor into Frostbite chance because of our passive tree, and this lets us stack Frostbite faster, which lets us kill every enemy that we fight more effectively and quicker. As I mentioned earlier, Frostbite chance is less literal damage increase than it is an acceleration increase to reach our peak damage per enemy faster, easier, and more consistently with less risk to ourselves. Frostbite duration is the same, really it lets you build up to maximum stacks faster, as well as keep them much easier with less mana spent, which is why it's also so good that we have that on the unique gloves itself. It's a really good increase to the actual output of the build, or at least the ramp up speed of the build and the ramp up consistency. Then you want to do your best to get bonus ranks to Frostclaw, and the best place to do that is on your actual relic. This can go up to +4 ranks if you get the absolute perfect one, and this is the most important skill in this build to get bonus ranks on, increasing our damage output by a pretty noticeable amount because of the extra points that you can actually spend. Then you want ranks of Ice Barrage, which can be on your chest. It would also be quite good, not quite equal to Frostclaw, but the next step down in importance. Then we just have a single roll of Crit Strike Avoidance on one of your rings at tier 5. This combined with the Blessing for Crit Strike Avoidance pretty much removes any enemy crits, which increases your survivability a fair bit in itself as well. Then we have Cast Speed, my personal favorite thing to just inject more of into here, but it also is sort of a double-edged sword. The higher your cast speed is, the tougher it is to keep up with the eventual mana drain of Frostclaw, unless you get lucky on mana refund procs from Gift of Winter. But also, faster cast speed means faster Frostbite application, and also directly translates to faster ward generation, both from Frostclaw cast itself, and more mana spent per second, giving us our mana spent to ward conversion too. Past that is just our general damage affecting things for the build: cold or elemental damage, damage over time, spell damage, cold penetration, then of course just intelligence, both for base damage increases and also the 4% ward retention that you get per intelligence, as well to help boost our ward based goals. Finally then we have our idols as well, and I mentioned earlier that you want your idols to give you at least 12% bonus mana efficiency with Frostclaw. Then past that, they're great for things like Frostbite duration, or even things like bonus ward, or Frostbite application chance with cold skills, which again, all very important stats that you want to collect in as high quantity as you can. And that just about covers it as far as what you actually want for both the skills, passives, and your gear too in an ideal situation with the build. So how do we actually go about playing the build? Well, it's relatively simple, but extremely enjoyable, honestly. Before actually engaging in combat, you should probably just spam Frostclaws a bit to generate some ward so you don't get instantly overwhelmed overwhelmed and bashed in the face. But then, after you've got a bit of ward, you want to teleport towards the enemies, use Ice Barrage in the direction facing them, making Ice Barrage free because you used it after teleport. Like I said earlier, Ice Barrage costs a ton of mana in this build, so genuinely you want to only use it after you teleport. Otherwise, it will just tank your mana and not let you spam Frostclaw as much as you should. For most non-boss content, you can make it through more than fine by literally just using teleport, then Ice Barrage on cooldown, spamming off a couple of Frostclaw hits here or there just to boost your ward, and then just walking through to the objectives. If you need some bonus ward, throw out some extra Frostclaws while you're doing it. If you come across a larger enemy or a group of enemies that might take some more killing, or you want the Frenzy or Haste buff, you should do the actual Frost Wall and put it down, either under enemies to brand them, which increases your damage, and ward generation if they are a rare or a boss. Speaking of which, when it comes to bosses, this does work a little bit differently, where you want to start by teleporting in and pressing Ice Barrage, put Frost Wall directly under them to apply the brand, then spam Frostclaw until you see them either hit 999 stacks of Frostbite, or until you start to run low on mana, whichever happens first. Then you want to back off for a couple of moments, unless you desperately need more ward in that second, let your mana come back just a little bit, and re-engage with the same combo to try and keep your boss permanently at 999 stacks. Then you also just want to use Runic Invocation more or less on cooldown, both for survival and stat buffs. And don't forget that this should be done before the teleport if you had enough points to grab Elementalist Call in Runic Invocation. And if you have that, you want to use Raywind's Frostguard, then you want to teleport on cooldown, and then you want to use Ice Barrage immediately after it for the free cast. You want to keep Frost Wall on top of bosses permanently, and if all of those prerequisites are met, you hug the boss and spam Frostclaw to create as many overlapping damage spots as possible. And again, if you do this either until the boss reaches 999 stacks, at which point you let off the gas, or if you start to have mana problems, where you should start just burst firing it a little bit instead of full holding down the button. That pretty much does it then, everyone. Everything you need to know about the new and improved, updated, now officially busted Infinite Frost Runemaster build, tailored for more proper, deeper endgame players. Hopefully you've enjoyed this. Hopefully I've done a decent job filling in for Josh here, our normal Runemaster build master on the channel, and I really hope that you all enjoy this if you try it out for yourself too, because it really is just a fantastically fun way to play the game that is exceedingly effective at the same time. Like if you liked the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.